for coming, and happy Valentine's Day, and happy Frederick Douglass's birthday. It is his birthday today, his 200th anniversary. This is our second Flash conference at the Institute, and we're calling these smaller discussions Flash conferences, just panels that we feel are addressing issues that are crucial in today's discourse and that can be discussed from a humanities perspective, from that historical, cultural, and theoretical set of angles that the humanities so wonderfully brings to current issues. The idea for today's panel actually came about first in a conversation that I had with Professor Mary Beth Rose, who is here in the audience with us. And my first reaction was that sexual harassment was self-evident, and that how could you have a conference around something that was just bad? But then, as the news cycle continued and continues to this day, it became clear that that opinion was completely wrong, and that we really can benefit from this kind of discussion from the multiple dimensions around harassment, sexual violence, and misconduct in schools, institutions, workplaces, the government, and so on. So I'm very grateful to have our three speakers, Ronette Kapadia, Dina Lewis, and Adrienne Massanari, who will be speaking to us today in that order. Professor Kapadia is Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and an affiliated faculty member in the Global Asian Studies and Museum and Exhibition Studies, that's a mouthful, at UIC. He's completing a book about the interface between contemporary visual art and aesthetics and U.S. global warfare in South Asia and the Greater Middle East, entitled Insurgent Aesthetics of the Forever War, Art and Performance After 9/11, and he's co-editor of the 2017 special issue of Surveillance in Society on Race and Surveillance. His work has been published in Asian American Literary Review, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Feminist Formations, and other venues. Outside of academe, Kapadia is a former board member of FIERCE, a member-led community that focuses on the leadership and power of queer and trans youth of color in New York City, and SAGE Community Health Collective, a worker-owned health and healing justice collective in Chicago. Dina Lewis is currently a doctoral candidate in educational policy studies at UIC, where she is also assistant director and a visiting clinical lecturer in gender and women's studies. Her scholarly and activist work focuses on trans and cis Black women and girls who have experienced state violence. Her research interests include Black girlhood studies, the school-prison nexus, and youth incarceration, among others. She is also a member of Love and Protect, a committee dedicated to supporting marginalized gender identities who are criminalized or harmed by state and interpersonal violence. She is a founding member of the Just Practice collaborative, dedicated to communities' responses to intimate partner violence and sexual assault outside of police or other state-based systems. Adrienne Massanari, our third speaker, is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at UIC. Her research interests include new media, gaming, digital cultures, design, gender, and ethics. Her recent book, Participatory Culture, Community, and Play, Learning from Reddit, considers the culture of the news aggregating and ranking website reddit.com. Her work has appeared in New Media and Society, Feminist Studies, First Monday, and many other venues. Prior to joining UIC, she was at Loyola and served as the director for the School of Communications Center for Digital Ethics and Policy. So please join me in warmly welcoming our speakers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Kennywell, and thank you, Linda Vavra, for organizing and convening us here at this Flash. I was saying jokingly that the Flash in the Flash conference is really the highlight of what I have prepared for today. Flash. There are so many overlapping political calamities in the world right now that it is really nice, actually, to have the opportunity to pause and to abide and to reflect on one slice of the broader constellation of political crises that we're experiencing in the here and now, right? And to reflect collectively on that dystopian here and now. So I'm going to speak for just under 20 minutes, and my plan is to do some flash sweeping framing of the issues at hand, and then try to historicize and contextualize our contemporary moment of feminist struggle, and then offer some examples of alternative strategies to combat gender and sexual violence. And then I'll close with a couple looming, unanswered, maybe unanswerable questions that I have that perhaps could help frame our discussion. So first, to say that this issue that this conference is attempting to respond to on violence, sex, power, representation, and the erotic highlights some of the most contentious sites of feminist theorizing and activism in the US since at least the late 1970s. So, one thing I'm thinking about is how does our current post-Trump era, what I've jokingly referred to as the long 2017, which stretches from November 2016 to the present, right? So how does the long 2017, because it does feel like that, represent a major flashpoint in a much longer history? And indeed, of course, for 500 plus years, Black and Indigenous women in the New World have been telling us about the nexus of sex, power, and violence that both shapes and undermines their lives. And so my remarks today are informed, of course, by that legacy, and also with a recognition that survivors of sexual and gender violence come in every shape, size, color, and gender, and that likely means there are many survivors in this room here today. And I proceed with the axiom that survivors of gender and sexual violence are best poised to offer analysis of the dystopian here and now and alternatives to end the crisis. So just to begin, as Mark alluded to, I'm a queer cultural theorist of race, war, and empire in the US, and my primary research is motivated by the problems of policing and security. Security both as a political tool employed by the US state and its institutions, as well as security as a kind of collective affective state experienced by racialized and gendered populations moving between and within these sites. So I focus primarily on the aesthetics and politics of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians in the US and globally. And I've just completed a book, actually this month, titled Insurgent Aesthetics of the Forever War on Contemporary Art and the Global War on Terror. But I also take my research and pedagogical cues more broadly from the survival strategies, knowledge practices, and world-making acts of resistance of queer and trans communities of color. Throughout, I'm inspired by how concepts and approaches in critical ethnic studies, intersectional feminisms, and queer of color critique can amplify our investigations of the overlapping political crises of our time, including racist police violence, mass deportations, foreign and domestic wars, rampant economic inequality, this list is getting long, resurgent nativism, ecological catastrophe, and of course also the sexual awakening or reckoning that is the subject at hand today. But of course, the language of crisis itself suggests a temporal break, a turning point, or a state of exception that is anything but to multiple communities already under siege in North America. If we look to the margins, we see that many populations, queer and trans people of color, women of color, immigrants and refugees from the global south, undocumented folks, Muslims, poor people, the homeless, sex workers, the imprisoned and their free world radical accomplices, indigenous people, crip and disabled folks, and so on, have all been subject to perpetual crises and endless states of emergency. So we can learn a lot about how to challenge the seemingly unrelenting nature of power and violence, as well as its differential dispensation, by listening to and learning from these communities. In fact, if we look historically, as I already alluded to, at the 500 plus years in which Black and Indigenous women and femmes have been telling us about the nexus of sex, violence, and power in their lives, we might be able to narrate our current crisis anew. So my first takeaway point today is to listen to and learn from the margins. In fact, I think this is one of the lesser noted but more appealing perks of doing time in the academy. The university itself remains a powerful, albeit imperfect and non-exclusive, site from which to critique the uneven distributions of power, resources, pleasures, and life chances in the social world, and to imagine alternative ways of organizing collective social life. But that project is rife with failures, as our institutions continuously disappoint us with endless power relations and inequities. We need only to think of those on college campuses without protected status, not just untenured junior faculty, of course, but groundskeepers, custodians, undocumented students, adjuncts, temporary workers, union activists, artists, debtors, anybody perceived to be Muslim or Mexican. The needs of these disparate groups are vast in the dystopian here and now. Those in more powerful positions of status can do much to support, fund, center, or simply make space for these marginalized voices and get out of the way. So the second takeaway today is let's work to downwardly redistribute our multiple forms of power and resources to the broadest number of people possible. So this intersectional sense of justice and struggle that I've begun to sketch here is certainly informed by Black, Indigenous, post-colonial, and women of color feminist praxis. It's also informed by my reading of the late Stuart Hall and his colleagues in the 1970s and 80s at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the UK. Hall was a towering figure in Black British and post-colonial studies. His writings offer a tart rejoinder to the obsession with representation that dominated avant-garde academic circles at the time. Hall argued, and with a patience that, looking back today with our endless social media wars, seems quite remarkable, that cultural representation plays a constitutive rather than merely an expressive role in social relations. This is really an axiom of critical cultural studies, right? The idea that art and expressive culture and media is not a mere reflection of the social world, but that it constitutes the social world, right? Hall's writings went on to introduce what is now called intersectionality, the recognition that, quote, the central issues of race always appear historically in articulation, in a formation with other categories and divisions, and are constantly crossed and recrossed by the categories of class, of gender, and of ethnicity, unquote. So by now we take for granted this notion of articulated categories, or a framework of intersectionality from Hall and Kimberly Crenshaw and countless others, who have formulated an understanding of race and class and gender, sexuality, religion, ability, and these other categories of social difference as co-constituted, that is coming into existence in and through relation to each other. But this understanding of articulated categories advanced by Hall and other Black British thinkers of the time went one step further to demonstrate the intersectional nature not only of social difference, but of culture, politics, and the economy too, right? Culture, politics, and economy are often still conceived as being these seemingly discrete spheres of inquiry. For example, in their classic volume, Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order, Hall and his comrades argued that the problems experienced by advanced capitalist nations like Britain and the US in the 1970s were not simply economic, but that the crisis of overaccumulation became a political and social crisis as well. That is, race, gender, and other salient categories of difference are at the heart of capitalist violence. Governments scapegoat outsiders, whether undocumented Latin American immigrants, trans and gender nonconforming people, sex workers, the homeless, the Syro-converted, Muslim Syrian refugees, and so on. The point here is that there is often an unseen cultural and ideological dimension to what is conventionally recognized as merely political or merely economic. So why does this matter? Well, I think that Policing the Crisis is an incredibly prescient text that provides a useful blueprint for understanding our ongoing crises of authority caused by police violence, mass and racialized incarceration in the US, seemingly permanent foreign and domestic wars, as well as struggles for global economic, environmental, social, and sexual justice. To better understand issues of crime, of terrorism, of immigration, of populism, of poverty, of gender violence, and so on, we need to adopt intersectional, interdisciplinary approaches to understand how seemingly distinct spheres collude in the production of dissident outsiders. So the third takeaway here, and it's a pretty fundamental, I think, basic one that we all share, is always work to understand problems at hand through an intersectional frame. And let me just pause here to complicate a little bit further the way I'm thinking about intersectionality. This is something I often say in my classroom, which is that there are, we can say axiomatically, that there are these intersectional systems of power and violence in the world. Examples: white supremacy and anti-Black racism, capitalism, patriarchy, misogyny, rape culture, homophobia and transphobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on, right? And that these systems of power and violence are often circulating in ways that overlap, that contradict each other, that are often incoherent unto themselves, and are often the unseen and unsaid that disproportionately impacts vulnerable groups. So, part of what I'm trying to approach bring to our discussion here is that an intersectional account of systems of power and violence allow us to understand why there is inequity, right, and an inequitable distribution of power, resources, pleasures, and life chances in the social world. I want to take this one step further to also say that I'm thinking not only about interpersonal forms of violence, but state violence. And I think in Dina's bio, she already alluded to this question, right? That when we think about interpersonal forms of violence, including harassment, rape, sex, murder, sexual violence, murder, that often colludes and contradicts and overlaps with these state forms of violence, right, that are enacted through every institution, whether that's the media and communication institutions, politics, real estate, military, the health institutions, fashion, arts, academia, and so on. And so can we look at our own institutions, our own academic institution, for instance, to think about how responses to gender and sexual violence play out? That's something I hope that we talk about today. And I think I would say that we are witnessing a profound, if limited, transformation and disordering of the long-standing inequities related to gender and sexuality in the US and globally. And that this reorganization requires new languages, new concepts and frameworks, new technologies, perhaps new policing and redistributive strategies to address these social transformations. Okay, now having said all this sort of meta abstract stuff, I want to just spend the remainder of my time honing in on three ideas. De-exceptionalizing the current moment, historicizing the current moment, and then trying to reframe the way that people are talking about this. So first, briefly, this idea of de-exceptionalizing. We need to de-exceptionalize the stories of individual, mostly famous, mostly wealthy, mostly cis and het white male perpetrators of sexual violence. Focusing on the wrongdoings of specific men makes it seem as if their actions took place in a vacuum. This is consistent, of course, with the mechanisms of the criminal legal system that focuses on individual guilt and of reformist politics premised on the idea that existing state formations and market economies would serve us perfectly if only the right people were in power, right? For example, if only women and people of color were large and in charge, then all of our problems would be solved. Well, we know this to not be the case, right? And so let's think about that in more detail. These forms of sexual violences that we are hearing about in the media are not exceptions, but inevitable systemic results of the social order. So how do we treat the cause as well as the symptoms? Especially when mainstream media coverage ignores the role of capitalism and other hierarchies that perpetuate and then also work to perpetuate the ideological claim that these systems can only be fixed through reform, which is to say that we have to pressure corporations to fire executives, and we have to use the media to shame media moguls, and we have to use democracy to punish politicians, right? This, in sum, the ideological claim that the only way that we're able to hold people in power, our abusers in power, is to use the very structures through which they have retained power, right? So, challenging a kind of reformist logic and a punitive logic is something that I hope that we talk about. The second, on the idea of historicizing, of course we know that sexual assault and rape are woven into the very fabric and origins of the United States as a racist, sexist settler colony, and that sexual assault and rape were systemically employed as colonial tools by settlers in North America against indigenous women, and that slaves too were routinely sexually assaulted. In fact, sex, rape, and reproduction were at the very heart of the system of chattel slavery. Women and femmes throughout history have fought against their abusers with creativity and tenacity. For example, we can think of Harriet Jacobs as one of the early forerunners of the metoo movement, as she documented letters to the New York Tribune in the 1850s detailing her experiences at the hands of slave owners, and ultimately publishing Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1860, one of the first books to detail enslaved women's experiences of sexual assault. And so when we think about Tarana Burke and the kind of alternative genealogies in which to understand the contemporary moment, we can stretch that back into the 19th century, if not earlier, right? Of course, also in the post-antebellum period, we know that workers routinely experienced sexual harassment and assault as they do now, and that unequal power dynamics between employers and employees obtain to this very day. And that in the early 20th century, women formed labor unions precisely to fight for the rights of female workers, and that black women's struggles against workplace harassment led to the creation of some of the first laws, writ large, against sexual discrimination and harassment in the workplace, and so on, right? So this flash history that I've just provided of the gendered and sexualized regulation of black, indigenous, immigrant, and working class women's lives is of course important for our own 21st century predicaments around sexual harassment in the workplace. Corporations will not solve the root problems here. Corporate success is determined by how much a profit a business produces, not by whether it protects women from a sexual assault. A standard utilitarian calculation has been utilized to dump the likes of Bill O'Reilly and Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Roger Ailes, Steve Wynn, Tavis Smiley, and so on. So what I'm getting at here, of course, is that capitalism, the state, and other forms of hierarchy offer sexual predators many ways of doing harm to those who resist them. So how do we deal with that question, right? We need to think through the structural limitations that disallow many women and femmes from fighting back against their abusers. Women, both cis and trans, and especially of color, are far more likely to experience poverty than men, and so on, right? So questions of job security are not simply about gender and sexuality, but also about economics. How do we think of gender and sexual violence then, while also keeping our eyes on other state systems of regulation and discipline, including immigration, criminal legal systems, the health system, and so on, that undermine the life chances of women and femmes? So, I think that in a nutshell here, abolishing capitalism and other systems that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few would not put an end or a stop to sexual assault writ large, but would certainly greatly reduce the coercive economic power that the rich and powerful wield over the rest of us. Okay, so in the absence of, or until we abolish capitalism, how do we reframe the current moment, right? All right. So, I'm going to end quite soon. So this last thought, of course, is about carceral feminisms and what increasingly we're talking about as abolition feminisms, as approaches and alternatives to a kind of punitive logic. So the way that this is structured is that the fundamental problem, abolition feminists say, is that the systems that purport to keep us safe, including the police and the military, actually make us vulnerable, and that we need to think more closely about the coercive apparatus of the law and the state. Can we create and amplify models of transformative justice that replace the criminal legal system without replicating any feature of it, to foster new ways of relating to patriarchy, white supremacy, and other forms of authority or power? And just to define the concept, I know Dina will be talking about this in more detail, but the concept of transformative justice is a community-based process developed by anti-violence activists of color, in particular, who wanted to create responses to violence that do what criminal punishment systems fail to do. That is, build support and more safety for the person harmed, figure out how the broader context was set up for this harm to happen, and how that context can be changed so that this harm is less likely to happen again. And I hope that we have more discussions and elaborations around the concept of transformative justice. So I'm going to quickly end here with some looming questions, and I'll just throw out some questions that I'm thinking about and maybe we'll be able to take up in our discussion. The first is this idea of toxic masculinity, which we say all the time, right? Toxic masculinity. And my question is, are there forms of masculinity operating in the social world today that are not bound up in toxicity? And what do they look like? And can we amplify them and think about them more closely, right? And this also ties to the discussion that's happening, I think, on social media around dismantling male-centered definitions of heterosexual sex, right? Sex that is not pleasurable, that is often violating, that is unacceptable and boring. And I'm thinking specifically of Aziz Gate and the story around Aziz Ansari and the kinds of questions that are emerging as a result of that Grace Ansari scandal. So demanding better straight sex, can we talk about that and what's happening there? The second question I have is this an anti-sex moment that we're in, or is it a pro-sex feminist moment, right? How are pro-sex and sex-positive feminists responding to the crisis? How are queer and trans perspectives challenging the idea that this could potentially turn into a sex panic? Is this a sex panic? I don't think so, right? But what are the racialized and class dimensions of sex panics? And how can we think about that in the context of a turn towards carcerality and the punitive approach more generally? Finally, what stories do Black, Indigenous, and other women of color's erotic lives tell us about the social world and its unequal distribution of power and resources and pleasures? How might we listen to, learn from, and be transformed by Black, Indigenous women of color and their complex erotic and fantasy worlds? And so, the take here is about women's eroticism, agency, pleasure, and embodiment, which seems to be absent from the conversation, right, when we talk about harassment. And I'm drawn to, Audrey Lord's famous articulation of the erotic as a site of both joy and political utility in anti-racist and anti-sexist action, right? So we think about hashtag Black Girl Joy or Black Girl Magic. Can we talk about eroticism as central to that joy and to the activation of pleasure? And there's a lot of scholars who are working in this domain. I'm thinking about the work of Nicole Fleetwood, or Jennifer Nash, or Amber Musser, or Juana Rodriguez, or Lamonda Horton-Stallings, and so many others. Finally, how do we have an accounting? And I'm thinking about questions of evidence, of sourcing, of journalism, of facts in the context of fake news, which we're living in. So how do we have an accounting or a reckoning, right, which is kind of the moment that we're in, 2017, 2018, when there's so little trust of the accountant, when there's so little trust about what constitutes truth and evidence and bodily autonomy, for that matter, in this moment? So those are my sort of looming questions, and with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. Come out this way. Okay. Sorry, that was long.
That's great. I'm going to kind of slide in there. I probably won't talk about transformative justice. I'm more on the kind of downside today, but I would love to talk about transformative justice in the discussion.
I try to cue you up.
Yeah, you did. You helped a non-tenured junior faculty out. Right? So I want to say thank you to Professor Canuel, to Linda Vavra, to the Institute for Humanities. I keep wanting to say the Illinois Institute for Humanities. Both great places, but different places. So as you know, my name is Dina Lewis. I do a lot of work on incarceration and focusing on people who have been criminalized due to defending themselves against interpersonal violence. So it's kind of my activist work. My scholarly work is focused on Black girls and Black girls and women and their experiences with incarceration. So it's total fun, my part of the world, just great reading, happy reading all of the time. So I'm talking, today the title of my talk is hashtag What About Me? Women in the Injustice System and the metoo movement. So the current resurgence of the metoo movement started about 10 years ago by Tarana Burke of Girls for Gender Equity, has brought sexual assault, harassment, and abuse into the light in a number of different industries, including entertainment, politics, academia, business. All of these industries have been shaken, and necessarily so, with the uncovering of long-held, not-so-secret secrets of abusers and harm doers in these tight-knit spaces. While MeToo has swept the US and seemingly helped to empower women to reveal the abuse and harm they received and to name the people who abused them and caused harm, there's one particular industry or space that hasn't been touched, and that's the criminal legal system. I approach the MeToo movement understanding the necessity and importance of the movement, but also with criticism of MeToo, and I'm also including the pink pussy hat brigades at large, in that they leave out critical voices and bodies that have been marginalized, essentially disposed of, and silenced. These are incarcerated and court-involved women. So today in this talk, I want to discuss my idea, my thought, my statement in the way that mainstream anti-violence movements, discourses, and organizations are constructed. Incarcerated women will not be a part of the movements and will not benefit from policy changes resulting from these movements because incarcerated women cannot occupy the perfect victim role that everyone can rally around. And I'm going to talk about what this role is in just a minute. But let me also kind of somewhat preface that I don't believe prisons should exist. They are places of extreme violence, state violence, interpersonal violence, just violence, period. So what I say, you should just remember that I don't believe prisons exist, that they're just violent, period. Okay. So why do I make this statement? Right? Why do I believe this? So first, I'm going to talk about the paradigm of the perfect victim. So domestic violence and sexual assault mainstream organizations and the broader public hold on to this paradigm. And most of the time, what we see kind of in the media is typically someone who is cisgender, who is considered basically innocent, no wrongdoing in their lives, often educated past K-12, stably employed in a respected industry, or a stay-at-home mother, or some combination of both. Person has stable housing, no criminal histories, and did nothing wrong to deserve the abuse or assault. Right? That's often said. And it's unfortunately said because nobody does anything wrong to deserve abuse or assault. Their stories speak to a large group of people who can sympathize or even almost empathize with that person. Their stories speak to a large group of people, so I ask, who can't get behind a working mother with multiple degrees, a house, a solid, stable job, who is sexually harassed and assaulted in the workplace? Similarly, who can't get behind women in Hollywood who fit mainstream ideas of beauty and grace, are great at their craft, are philanthropists, well thought of, whose images are known worldwide? Who can't get behind an Uma Thurman, a Meryl Streep, a Reese Witherspoon? So it makes sense that these women and women like them are pushed to the forefront of the movement because we have been forced, we meaning the public, have been forced to identify these images of these women as good and laudable and to be emulated for so long that we can actually say, wait a minute, if they can be assaulted or harassed or abused, does that mean I could be? Does that mean my sister, my mother, my aunt, my girlfriend? And so we can identify to some extent with these people. And recognizing that sexual abuse and assault are widespread types of violence that can happen to anyone is good. That's a good thought. But identifying with only the people who fit this perfect victim model is not good. It is a problem. And actually, these are not even the women or the girls that Tarana Burke had in mind when she began to say Me Too. Right? It was young girls of color who were sexually abused, harassed, and assaulted at home and in and around schools. She talks about, in interviews, she talks about the first time she wanted to say Me Too when a 13-year-old black girl who was considered trouble, and let me say, a lot of black girls at that age are viciously and mistakenly considered trouble. So when this black girl disclosed the sexual assault to Tarana, and Tarana couldn't and was unable to say, Me Too, and instead directed her to another person for assistance, Tarana wanted to try to undo something that couldn't be undone, but she could push something else forward for women and girls of color. Right? And many of us have done something like this, not been able to say Me Too in that moment and not been able to go back and talk with that person and kind of brush them off to somebody else. So the demographics of the girls that Tarana Burke was interested in are similar to the demographics of the girls and women who are currently incarcerated. So I'm going to show some troubling statistics. So these incarcerated girls from the ACLU, according to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, black women represent 30% of all incarcerated women, even though they are only 13% of the US population. The same for Latinx women, representing 16% of incarcerated women, although they are only 11% of the US population. Some other disturbing statistics, since the 1970s, the incarceration rates of women have skyrocketed, right? This is a huge number, 832% more women in prison now than in 1977. 1 in 10 are sexually assaulted in prison. More than 80% of women incarcerated experience domestic violence, child abuse, and or sexual abuse, assault prior to incarceration. In some women's prisons, up to 94% of the women are survivors of sexual assault or physical abuse. 90% of the women incarcerated for killing a boyfriend or husband did so to protect themselves. So these stats and stats I don't have up here represent a number of things. One, trauma before being incarcerated, re-traumatization after being incarcerated, and if on the chance of release, continued trauma when coming back into society. So I'm going to hold on to this for just a second, but let me point out that none of these stats match up with the personal victim paradigm. And because it doesn't match up with the perfect victim paradigm, it's much easier for the larger public, but more importantly, mainstream anti-violence organizations to not get involved in their cases, in their lives, and actually say, yeah, we can't do anything about your Me Too. We have these people that we need to work with. Right? And so someone needs to actually say, hey, we hear your Me Too and we listen to your Me Too and we can do something about it, but instead incarcerated women are continued to be silenced and, as the quote said at the beginning, preferably unheard. So my second reason to back up my statement, prisons are not feminist. Prison industrial complex are not feminist. These two youngins, who are actually going to take care of me when I get older because they're my good friends' kids who are actually in the back there, know that prison is not feminist. So my second reason, the criminal legal system is seen as a space where punishment is meted out, not justice or rehabilitation. The label criminal is mapped onto people, and the newly labeled, or I should actually say officially labeled criminals, since Black and brown bodies are already criminalized regardless of their status with the criminal legal system. These officially labeled criminals are banished until they have served their time, served their debt to society, and ready to come back to society as productive citizens after atoning for their missteps and crimes. Some of the most vulnerable of U.S. society are incarcerated people, specifically women, more specifically transgender women of color. Locked away in stark buildings with limited access to the outside world and limited access from the outside world in, people on the inside face startling violence and dehumanization that should shock us all. Transgender women, who are already not centered in the Me Too movement, and are summarily pushed to the side and stepped upon by the pink pussy hat brigades, face violence in jail that serves to only deepen the transphobia that undergirds our nation. For instance, trans women are often misgendered and placed in prisons that do not match their gender identities or expressions, which puts them in extreme danger and serves to punish them more. So I have an example. This is Jules Williams with her lawyer. So I just read about her story of being booked into the Allegheny County Jail in Pittsburgh. And she was booked into the men's part of the prison. So fearing for her life, she asked to be placed with the incarcerated women. She was denied. So she was housed with cisgender men, even though there's actually a jail policy here that states that transgender people are to be put in single cells. Jules was harassed, she was beaten, she was sexually assaulted. She asked to be placed in protective custody. She was placed in protective custody, but she was sharing a cell with another person, a cisgender man, who repeatedly raped her. And the guards heard this and did nothing about it. Later, Jules was placed in what they term a suicide cell, which is a cell that has has transparent walls so that the guards and actually anybody can look in. The idea is that the person is isolated there so they can, the guards can watch them for their safety. Okay? I just want to say a side note that a person who is suicidal in jail, isolating them further from human contact and from talking with other people is not safe. There's nothing safe about that. While she was in this cell, she was stripped naked in front of everyone, the guards and the other incarcerated people, all of whom were men. This is torture. No one was fired, no one went to trial, but most importantly, no one was held accountable for the violence that was meted out on Jules. As Ronak was saying, this is also not about the individual person, not about the individual people in that jail. This is a systemic problem, and that this state violence is actually normal. For women in women's jails, it doesn't get much better. Okay. So prison is about punitive punishment. So these photos of jail cells in England, right? So you notice there are 4 bunk beds in this very small cell. I don't think you can see the toilet in there. You can see the toilet paper, but you can't see the toilet. In South Dakota, right? So you can see that there aren't doors, there are only curtains. In Tennessee, okay? So this is an 8-cell bunk, 8-bunk cell. There are over 13 women, and you can see here the mattresses on the ground. These photos are only proof that prison is dehumanizing. This last one in Santa Ana is on Christmas Day as women wait for their families to arrive for a short visit. Okay, so it looks like it's in some sort of gym/auditorium. For Jules and other women who experience this dehumanization, sexual assault, sexual abuse, I have to ask, where was that in the sentencing process? How does this violence, besides the violence of being incarcerated, where does this violence appear in the court documents that detail their prison terms? How does this punishment mean justice or rehabilitation? What debt is being served for the violence that they experience while they are incarcerated? All of these women are survivors, and all of them should say me too, but who hears them? Who listens? Who does anything? Certainly not senior corrections officers who are either complicit or actually committing the violence. The administrations are not listening. And the women who experience the assaults, the abuse, will experience blowback when they're reporting the crimes, right? And think, if someone is in there for a long period of time, they have to do this kind of balancing act of, if I report the crime, if I report this assault from this officer who's been at this prison for a long period of time, and I know the administration doesn't really care, doesn't really listen, and I still have to be here for 5 years, does it make sense to suffer the consequences that this guard is going to put on me for that period of time? So with the sweeping Me Too movements, there will be policy changes. Do I think policy changes will occur for incarcerated women? Not at all. And here's some proof. So if prisons and jails cannot do the bare minimum for women to sustain a modicum of a healthy life, then the chances of the wardens, sheriffs, corrections officers, prison companies, the state, addressing sexual abuse complaints, holding people accountable for that, is pretty small, right? It's a really small chance. And when I say bare minimum, I want to give you some examples because a lot of people don't understand what it's like in jail. but also what happens, like what what just regular everyday life is like, right? So some of us in here, we menstruate, right? We have our different rituals around that, right? So imagine being in jail and not being provided menstrual pads. Tampons are a definite no-no, but not being provided menstrual pads. Or being provided 12 for the month that are less than this then. Or having them accessible in the commissary, but you must pay for them. Having 3 people in a 2-person cell. Having 13 people in an 8-person cell. With the toilets right there. Not providing toilet paper, not providing soap, issuing new undergarments 1 time per year, suspending visitation or only allowing video visitation that might work depending on the connection and how long it takes you to connect to the internet and how long the jail takes. These are bare minimum things that we're talking about to have people feel human. Right? And so if I say that if the prisons are not doing that, then they're not going to do these sweeping policy changes because they're not being held accountable either. An org I work with, Survived and Punished, we like to remind people that we need to remember that survivors include people with prior arrests and criminal records, undocumented immigrants, sex workers, and people who work in street economies, people who use or sell substances. So it is important to challenge the idea that survivors, the term survivors, and criminals are 2 diametrically opposed groups. And understanding that, we affirm the lives and self-determination of all survivors of domestic and sexual violence, knowing that abuse and incarceration are both meant to isolate and diminish the person. We organize for more restorative resources and transformative options for survivors. Many of those options Ronak alluded to. We believe in a world where gender justice is possible, where women, both trans and cis, of color, and queer and transgender people of color are no longer targeted for abuse, rape, violence, and murder, and can live in dignity and safety. I also want to include in that not only trans and cis, but gender nonconforming people, gender non-binary people, agender people. So I would like to end with some soothing and revolutionary words from our Lord, Audrey. I typically like to end my talks with a call to action that people can do as soon as they leave or while they're still here. But this time I leave you with the brilliance of Audrey Lord and hope that you do not remain silent because our sisters' lives are at stake. This is a litany for survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, learning to be afraid for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you.
I don't know how I'm going to follow that. I'll try. Yes, that's fine. All right, so hi. Thanks so much for being here today. Hi. I want to sort of telescope out to perhaps a different perspective on this topic. Just a little background about the kind of work that I do. I'm in communication. My focus is new media. I've been increasingly doing a lot of work around geek masculinity and issues of gender. I'm very interested in the ways in which sort of technologies are marshaled to silence certain voices and marginalize certain voices, and also amplify others. And this has increasingly kind of driven me to be interested in sort of the development of things like the alt-right, and sort of how the alt-right, in quotes, and how the language of memes and the discursive patterns of that space are being used to, for white ethno-nationalism, white supremacy, neo-Nazism, all that. So super upbeat also. But I want to actually focus today a little bit telescoping out to this larger question that I've been struggling with, which is why are we not seeing a Me Too moment in technology, in tech industry, and more specifically gaming, the gaming industry. It seems like a no-brainer on some level that we would have this, but I have some sort of ideas about why we are not seeing this sort of groundswell of this. And some of you might be familiar with one reason, I'll get to it later, but I want to start with a little bit of a story. Audrey Richards, in 2013, attended a conference, open source conference for a programming language called Python. She heard two men behind her talking about dongles and forking, and tweeted this out. She shared it on Twitter. Conference organizers, as you can see there, they responded. The rest of the internet was too. So one of the male developers was fired, then the other one was. And this later became known as Donglegate, because of course it was, because everything has to have a gate. But it also resulted in Richards becoming a target of virulent online harassment, including death and rape threats, hate speech, graphic pornography, doxing, all of the things that we associate now with what this means to be public, and particularly a woman of color in public on the internet. And this was sort of done ostensibly because people thought she was responsible for the individuals being fired because of this. Her company, SendGrid, she was a developer evangelist, which meant she went around to kind of events like this and was promoting sort of the company, but also open source development. Her company, SendGrid, became the target of DDoS attacks, which is basically where hackers make the site impossible to access. So effectively, removing it from the internet. And then a bunch of petitions were circulated to boycott SendGrid and to ask for her firing. And she was eventually fired, because of course she was. This is the world in which we live. The company released a statement clarifying their decision that read in parts, so Audrey Richards felt comments made behind her during a conference session were inappropriate and of an offensive sexual nature. We understand that Audrey believed the conduct to be inappropriate and support her right to report the incident to PyCon personnel. To be clear, SendGrid supports the right to report inappropriate behavior whenever and wherever it occurs. What we do not support was how she reported her conduct. Her decision to tweet the comments and photographs of the people who made the comments crossed the line. Public shaming the offenders and bystanders was not the appropriate way to handle the situation. Even PyCon has since updated their code of conduct due to this situation. Needless to say, heated public debate ensued. The discourse, productive at times, quickly spiraled into extreme vitriol. A SendGrid developer's evangelist responsibility is to build and strengthen our developer community across the globe. In light of the events over the last 48 plus hours, it has become obvious that her actions have strongly divided the same community she was supposed to unite. As a result, she can no longer be effective in her role at SendGrid. So the reason I mention this is Donglegate, as it became known, solidified a common refrain within the tech community. Basically, women and people of color are not really welcome. It's a space for men, and mostly white men at that. While we can talk about, and probably should talk about, this sort of idea of public shaming, and obviously is a multi-headed hydra that can have both positive and deleterious effects, I want to focus our discussion today about some of the underlying reasons why tech companies, and specifically the gaming arm of the technology industry, have not had a Me Too moment in the same way that other creative industries, film, media, business in general, have had. So I'm kind of arguing that there are 4 major factors working against the Me Too in gaming. 1, the nature of mainstream games as cultural texts. 2, industry norms that create a culture hostile to women and people of color, which one must endure to be successful in mainstream gaming studios, and this is marked as just how it is. 3, the myth of meritocracy, which pushes against any sort of institutional or structural barriers to access. And 4, probably not surprisingly, Gamergate, which has effectively made speaking out against these realities impossible. So the first. So while 50% of the gaming audience is women, many of the mainstream, or as we call them, AAA titles, and most popular games like Grand Theft Auto traffic in racist and sexist content, which supports a straight white male gaze. In turn, the audience for many games is assumed to be straight white men. Young men, typically, although this is not true, but usually we consider it to be, teenage to about 30 as the core gaming demographic. They're problematically positioned as core by the industry itself, with everyone else relegated to the sidelines. This despite the fact that women, people of color, all kinds of people are playing games, and are playing games like Grand Theft Auto, and are doing so and the same reason that they consume all kinds of cultural products, but they are not considered the target audience for whom games are designed. And of course, we can see how AAA titles like Grand Theft Auto reproduce hegemonic femininity and masculinity in very, very disturbing sorts of ways. This is reproduced in turn within gaming fandom, so gaming communities. So what kind of games you play become a litmus test for whether or not you are really a gamer. So in this case, we have some gatekeeping going on here. Boy, I wish more girls liked video games. And the girl says, I like video games. And the boy says, no, you don't, fuck you. What's the length of Mario's inseam? Asking for a very particular detail that no one would know. This becomes, this trope is trotted out all the time in gaming fandom. And it's particularly noticeable especially if it is a gender non-conforming person or a person of color or a disabled person. There's all kinds of ways in which gatekeeping happens in these communities. So who games and what kinds of games they play becomes a key part of the, quote, gamer identity, which is a problematic term, but one I'm going to use for the moment. So people who play Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto are considered hardcore gamers, the core gaming, while those who play Candy Crush are merely casual. And we can't help but, sort of notice, surprise, surprise, that most of the people who are playing casual games are older women and people of color and all kinds of other people. That demographic has a much broader, casual games has a much broader, more diverse gaming demographic. So if this becomes the environment in which one is working, to succeed in gaming is to perhaps ideally work in for a AAA studio on games like this, then it also works to normalize sexism and racism as being how it is, as background noise that one must be put up with to be in the industry. And this is also complicated and further compounded by events that showcase the industry. E3, a yearly professional trade show, which I used to go to many years ago, has this. Also normalizes this idea that gaming is for young men. These are booth babes, that's what they're called in the biz. Usually scantily clad models hired to attract the attention of attendees, ostensibly to sell them something, but usually for photo ops. They were a regular feature at E3, the exhibition, until they were banned in 2006, then unbanned in 2009. In 2010, Nintendo released its then new portable gaming system, the 3DS, which it tethered to models because it said it was a security hazard to have these floating around on the floor, but they instead put models with this 3DS on there so that the people attending the show, who are predominantly men, would have to stand there next to a model and play. While it's not as prevalent as they once were, and now sometimes dressed more in cosplay attire, so ostensibly having some connection to the games that they're trying to promote, promotional models are still a thing. And there are such a thing as booth bros, which is not quite the same thing. They're almost always women still. And policies that restrict women like this from working in this environment. So, for example, Penny Arcade has a conference every year that restricts this, doesn't necessarily extend to any invite-only, parties that happen, which is, of course, where all the action happens. And most of these happen in sort of dance club-like atmospheres, and there's sometimes cages with people dancing, and we can imagine what that might look like. And they're booze-filled events, right? And you can imagine what kinds of things might go on at these kinds of events. Again, blurring the line between work and play, which is a popular pastime of the tech industry generally, and normalizing men as active agents and women as sexualized objects. Gaming studios in general are also notorious for embracing startup culture, regularly featuring long periods of 80 to 100-hour work weeks. It's like a badge of honor, known as crunch time. Cool office spaces with free food, foosball, gaming consoles, and beer on demand, and without pesky things like hierarchies and well-developed corporate policies, and a sense that one only needs to be good at the job to succeed and to be in the industry. Well, we can immediately see how such an environment is implicitly hostile to many people who might have families or need to take care of elderly parents, or just not interested in having their work and home life so intertwined, to say the least. This kind of culture also churns through people, making it the domain of mostly young, mostly unattached men who burn out by the time they are 30. And also because gaming tends to work on this idea of autobiographical design, often people who work in game design roles often create games that they think would be fun to play. They reflect the same sort of social context in which they come from. So this non-diversity of the industry also reifies and creates games that tend to reflect a non-diverse perspective. So among other things, there's so many things going on here. Because this is seen as a very coveted role by people in technology, to work in a game company is like the ideal job, people are willing to put up with this crap. And if one accepts the idea that people succeed in the game business solely on their own merits, this myth of meritocracy, then they necessarily reject the very real barriers to entry and participation that exist for women and people of color and anyone in a non-normal, dominant social category. Tech companies often embrace their scrappy DIY approach to business, tout their informal atmospheres, which means that any actual policies around, say, things like harassment, or attempts to diversify the culture of these spaces, will be viewed with skepticism or outright rejected as corporate. The myth of meritocracy is so embedded in Silicon Valley that I would argue it permeates every aspect of our relationship to technology, all of us. Even how social media platforms are designed imply a white male centrality in terms of emphasizing visibility, communication, and connection over public safety, for example. But that's kind of another talk. We can talk more about that. The reality is that the few women who do work in gaming are most often present in what are viewed as support roles, marketing, HR, and project management. These are tacitly believed to be secondary to the main mission of companies, that is, working as artists, level designers, producers, and developers. This becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, one which tech bros have filled in with their own reasons for why women aren't in these core roles. We saw this recently with the manifesto that former Google employee James Damore wrote, claiming women are biologically less capable at engineering. Such intellectual hurdles are needed to embrace the myth of meritocracy while still dealing with the reality that women are much less likely to work in the tech industry. And of course, these barriers are not just industry realities, they are supported at the earliest stages of how we socialize boys and girls to think about technology and games as kids, and how women and people of color are marginalized in university programs, preparing them for STEM careers as two small examples along a long trajectory. We can also imagine how easily the women that do succeed in the games and technology space, particularly in development roles like this, might position themselves as one of the guys as a coping strategy, downplaying both the daily microaggressions and outright harassment that they experience. this could create a culture where speaking up effectively ends one's career. And we can also tie this to how tech and American culture generally fetishizes individual responsibility. So thinking about Sheryl Sandberg's sort of problematic feminist, post-feminist neoliberal notion of leaning in, instead of questioning or overthrowing the system as the solution. But I'd say perhaps the biggest impediment to a ground-swelling movement like Me Too taking hold in games is Gamergate, which probably some of you are familiar with. Ostensibly about ethics in games journalism, Gamergate was a coordinated harassment campaign of women and people of color, as well as their allies, working within and around games that started in 2014. The very quick primer, because it's kind of complicated, is this. Independent game developer Zoe Quinn became the target of a poison pen blog post by her former lover, which suggested she received positive press for her games because of alleged sexual relationships she had with gaming journalists. This blog post then makes its way to 4chan, where it resulted in the doxing and harassment of Quinn. Conservative actor Adam Baldwin chimes in on Twitter about the PC police and social justice warriors ruining games, and coins the term Gamergate because, of course, we have to have some sort of gate. Then Gamergate talk gets kicked off of 4chan's board, but finds a cozy home on Reddit, which I study, where it still exists to this day. If you'd like to, I wouldn't suggest going to look it up, but you can. And then those who use the hashtag in any case on Twitter end up getting swarmed with @mentions. By Gamergaters, suggesting that the entire event was actually about ethics in games journalism and not harassment, that any harassers were just trolls, or it was actually false flag operations by Zoe Quinn, Anita Sarkeesian, Brianna Wu, and others who were harassed, and they were doing it for sympathy. It's ridiculous. Numerous journalists stopped covering games as a result, and it had a chilling effect on the number of women entering the game development space, and tech in general, I would say. We can also thank Gamergate too, for both highlighting the tactics and discursive realities that the alt-right has been bringing us to this day, and also bringing things like Milo Yiannopoulos, cultural Marxism, Steve Bannon, and Breitbart into our cultural lexicon. There's a lot that could be said here about this, and I'm working on several pieces related to this about Gamergate and the connection to the alt-right. But for the purposes of this talk, the important piece to remember is that it signaled to everyone in the starkest terms that gaming was a toxic space where harassment would be normalized. Really nothing happened. Nothing has changed since Gamergate happened. If anything, it's just reduced the amount of willingness of people coming forward. And to come out in force under the Me Too banner, I wonder if part of this is that this is the bedrock of this industry. Harassment and, like sort of a tacit, a sexist and racist attitude is the bedrock of the tech industry. So what would be left if this was, if there was a Me Too moment in games or in technology writ large? So we can also think about how the common refrain, "it's only a game," reinforces the idea that all these barriers to participation are meaningless, and that harassment, like we saw in Gamergate, just isn't real. So as Stephanie Beaulieu and Patrick Lameau note in their excellent book about metagaming, the standard metagame, quote, trains players to consume software in particular often narrowly defined ways, but also conflates how we play video games with video games as a black box and commodity fetish. This standard metagame, they say, reinforces the techno-utopian belief in the progressivist and teleological upgrade path, the escapist fantasy of sensory and cognitive immersion within virtual realities, the ideal of a magic circle that levels the playing field and guarantees fair competition, the post-gender and post-racial hope that in the game all players are equal and can be quantitatively compared, the authority of an implied author whose creative choices are autonomous from historical or political contexts, the libertarian dream that the market is not only free but just, and that, quote, voting with your wallet is democratic, and the nostalgia for collective identity based on consuming video games. So I'm going to end it there, and I hope that we can have some questions. So thank you.
Well, thanks to all three of you, and we'll open things up to questions, and I can kind of help follow. There you go.
I just wanted to thank everybody for these wonderful, provocative papers. And Deanna, I thought your depiction of prison was just devastating and rhetorically so effective with the examples you chose. And my question to everyone is, there seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just listening, there seems to be an assumption that the Me Too movement is working and that other people are left out, but I'm not so convinced of that. There have been laws against sexual harassment for decades, and guess what? So like Deanna, you said these wonderful policies are going to come out of it and not affect people in prison. Totally convincing. But are we so sure the wonderful policies are going to come out of it? That's what I wonder what you all think. I mean, thinking about who's left out of it is so important.
Yeah.
And I'm really going to think about that more. But then I'm wondering about the left-outedness of the people who are in it, and are we so sure they're going to be okay?
I don't think there's any coherence or assumption that, at least on my part, that things are working.
Right.
Because, and I think, as I alluded to in trying to do a flash historicization, women and femme people have been talking about sex violence and their erotic lives being entangled with forms of abuse and power for 500 plus years.
And legislating against it in the last few decades, and guess what? Here we are, right?
Yeah, and so one thing that I didn't mention in my talk, but maybe I'll just put on the table, is that the Franz Fanon idea of horizontal violence. So that in a moment when we're seeing sexual predation from the top downwards, right? So we have President Trump in this moment, right? That the inability to diffuse that sort of stranglehold over power produces these forms of horizontal violence, right? So people reacting to their bosses and their managers, and casting out and sort of shaking these institutions, which we know to be toxic. I think prisons and tech industry are such vivid, contrasting relations of institutional sites that demonstrate the seams of these issues of power. But that in the absence of being able to get the King Koopa, I don't know how to use a game metaphor here.
That was great. That was amazing.
King Koopa, is that my gaming stopped with early Nintendo.
No, that
right?
was unbelievable.
Yeah. All of these other kinds of sort of upheavals are part of what we're saying. But I don't know that will enact systemic policies that will affect people more broadly.
Yeah, I would agree. I do believe that the movement's working for some people,
But in
much
what way?
legislation.
I hope you're right, but in what way?
So this is the part of, you were mentioning, Ronak, about like the naming and shaming, and I think you were mentioning that it's, we can talk more about it. Does it actually work? Is it actually the right thing to do, right? Naming and shaming is working right now for people who are in certain positions, right? So Harvey Weinstein was named, he was shamed, he lost his company, and people, and specifically women who have a lot of money, majority white, in Hollywood feel more empowered to say, this has been happening to me and today it stops. So whether policies come out from that, I'm not sure. But there is a power of naming and shaming that that helps some survivors, right?
Well, I agree on Harvey Weinstein, then I'll stop. But I mean, Harvey Weinstein's also being prosecuted by the state of New York right now.
Yeah.
So I agree, but I think it's, as you all pointed out so well, it's a glamorous moment. But it's only going to, proof is only going to be in the future, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's really working. And it would be great if we could unite all these areas of suffering to that commonality.
Yeah.
But I think I think we can't be just totally optimistic that it's going to work, right? We
Right.
can hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can see because of the movement, like the actual
Right.
movement,
Right.
that there probably will be policy changes down the road.
We hope, yeah.
Will they work, right?
And what
will
would
they
look
be
like,
effective?
do you think? What would they look like,
Will
do you
they,
think?
what will they look like, and will they actually work for everybody? Or
Right.
will, like other legislation, will they serve to criminalize people of color even more?
Even more, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to not
I mean, I obviously coming from my own perspective here, which is, that I think that the fact that this has been conflated with the hashtag movement, which of course is not where it started, but like that has become like that this is happening in a space that Twitter, which is a technology space, has sort of, and has all kinds of other barriers to entry as well, that I think can't be disentangled from this question of like who can participate and what will meaningful change look like.
Right.
Because the reality of it is all these people who cannot come forward for multiple reasons, choose not to, but also, and so, yeah, the kind of question of like the white women in Hollywood basically rising up against Harvey Weinstein, on one level, I'm happy about that, but it also feels very much like a 1%er kind of solution to, does this trickle down in the same way that our economics do?
Does it trickle down
like,
to them?
right, does it like become something, and I mean, I would like to think that this, mobilizes people and change, but I also think that it does work to also marginalize, as you were mentioning, all of the people who do not fit in that perfect victim category, which is most people. I mean, there's like, think about all, I mean, if this was not being if this was being not sort of adjudicated in the court of public opinion, but in the courts, okay, so there's now going to be a whole other set of sort of systems and with their own sets of power structures that are usually not in favor of people of color and many women, to adjudicate this in the same way that rape cases are, or other kinds of cases, which so it's happening now, and like, yeah, Uma Thurman can come forward and say all of the things that she says in a very misguided Maureen Dowd column, but that
was a weird.
Oh, that was terrible,
Yeah,
right?
really
So,
was.
but like, there's something different happening here because this is happening in public. So maybe yes, change happens eventually and gradually, but I don't know policies, and I also don't know what that would even look like. How does that even happen?
That's what I mean.
Actually, I want to lift up the question around transformative justice, because I think when we conflate change with a policy outcome, right, or a kind of juridical perspective that says we're going to have laws and legislation, and we're going to have this punitive system where we're going to put away the predators and the monsters and pull them out of society, right, and then all of our problems will be solved. We know that change takes many forms, right? And that transformative forms of justice are saying we actually have to transform all of the institutions that we are implicated in, right? While interrogating our own implicatedness simultaneously. And so people have said, okay, it's been 3 months. What's the outcome, and can we put it on an Excel sheet and then call it a day? And that's of course not how transformation happens. It's also not how. When we've been living with 500 plus years of toxic masculinity and white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy, it's not like a 6-month process is going to resolve that crisis and that we're going to be able to move forward. So how do we imagine alternatives to the social worlds that we want to inhabit while still living and participating and being complicit in institutions and worlds that are racked with violence, right, and pain, as you mentioned?
Yes, please.
So I have a question. A couple of times, at least two of you mentioned, and I think you sort of phrased it like this imaginative idea that if only people of color were in charge, or if only women were in charge, then the problems wouldn't be there. And I agree, politically I agree with that, and theoretically I agree with that. Right now I'm writing about a particular incident that happened at Spelman College in the 70s. For almost 100 years, Spelman, which is a black women's college, did not have a black woman as president. All white women and one black man had been president to that point. And the students who were really picking up on the building of the modern black feminist movement demanded that a black woman be president. And for them, it was more than just like representation. It wasn't a narrow identity politics. It was really reflective of their belief that society completely needed to be restructured. So can we maybe talk a little bit about that and the possibilities of those representations?
Yeah. So, I like that you said narrow identity politics, because identity politics gets banded around in this moment in ways that are all pejorative and horrible, and maybe we should re-seize a kind of an expansive identity politics that works for us in terms of anti-racism and anti-sexism. So, the narrow form of identity politics says that all we need to do, we have these structures, and we just need to change the color and constitution of those structures, and we don't have to interrogate that those structures are invested in these inequities and inequalities, right? And a more expansive form of identity politics would say, no, we have to dismantle these institutions and these structures, reinterrogate the questions of power and hierarchy, and simultaneously, there is something to be said for people of color and women who are both white and people of color, right? You know, I rebuff the white and people, you know, the women.
Yeah, I know.
Because implicitly it's white women and people of color, right? But we could say people of color are all genders too simultaneously, right? So that there is something meaningful for a black woman to be the president of Spelman that is more than, as you rightly pointed out, about representation. And it goes back to what I was saying around Hall, that actually having a black woman in a position of power in that way creates consequences and impacts that we can't know in advance, right? And that can reconstitute the social world differently and in ways that, as I'm saying, we don't know in advance, right? And so I think that's really exciting that you're looking at that particular historical moment in the 70s to do that work. I don't know if other folks
I was
want to
going to say
speak on
too,
that.
like, I mean, one of the frustrations that I see too is that, you know, where are men in this conversation?
Right. Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they're not there,
Oh.
but like this is, I mean, I think another piece of
Totally.
this is like, again, the work is falling predominantly on women of color
As always.
as
Yep.
per usual to like push forward this and to you know, to kind of continue to be the moral conscience.
Yeah.
And it's like, and that's so, I mean, it's frustrating because it seems like that's also the piece of this sort of question about transforming institutions requires, you know, some actual participation from people who are
Absolutely.
doing, you know, a large portion of
Yeah.
the victimization.
Absolutely. I mean, Steve Bannon talks about the fear that he now has around an
Oh, yeah.
anti-patriarchy movement taking hold, and it's like, good, you're right.
Yeah,
right?
I know,
And-
right on.
Yeah, and so to go to the, just to
Should
put a
be.
button on your idea of the expansive identity politics, I always say, like, white supremacists come in every color, right? And anti-racists come in every color too, right? And the same is true around the analytical work of anti-patriarchy or anti-sexism or anti-misogyny, right? That is a kind of analytic lens and an intellectual and political project that people of all genders can participate in, with a recognition that women and femmes are more likely to experience the effects of those systems of power and violence in their lives. Yeah.
I wanted to throw in something about the Title IX reporting and because I mean when we're looking for something about what works, what doesn't work, I mean it's hugely problematic
Sure.
in many ways and doesn't address this issue of
Yeah.
large-scale transformation. But I was wondering if any of the three of you had comments on that, because it does touch on an issue of policy, and it does touch on the issue of like who's being benefited at this time, because you know the answer within academia, you know, it's like I mean it actually works for some people, and so what are people's thoughts on that?
Title IX reporting.
The fact that we have this, like in
Oh, I
certain
see.
institutions, we have these rigorous structures that allow certain
Right.
people to report instances and actually do something about certain cases.
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
Yeah.
although
So
it's hugely problematic,
Totally.
but what do people have to say about
Okay, well, let me just pitch two books that have been, there's so much writing around the problematics of Title IX within feminist studies that I think people are curious about. So Jennifer Doyle, who's a professor in English at UIC Riverside, has written this book called Campus Sex, Campus Security, and she looks at a series of case studies around Title IX and campus assault and her own experiences sort of enmeshed in those juridical structures. And of course, our colleague at Northwestern, Laura Kipnis, who has written prodigiously around this question in ways that are very provocative and complicated. I think the reason that it's complicated is because it creates a fissure within the landscape of feminist activism and theorizing in our contemporary moment in ways that are not resolved, right? And people are talking past each other, and sort of like I'm doing right now with your question, right? Where people are skirting around the issue because Title IX obviously doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It's tied to all of these other sorts of administrative procedures and all these other kinds of questions that enmesh people of difference in our institutions. So yeah, it's complicated.
And punitive systems.
Yeah,
And
of
like,
course.
so it's also, when I think about Title IX and also the Clery Act, I also think about the Violence Against Women Act.
Right.
And how
94.
that works really well for some people.
Yeah.
And it has contributed to, as you know, my mentor and amazing scholar, activist feminist Beth Ritchie talks about that has contributed a lot to mass incarceration and racialized mass incarceration. Well, one of the issues for one of the many issues I have with Title IX is that it's not only is it punitive, it's punitive for the harm doer and the person who's disclosing, because if you work at university, you're a mandated reporter, you have to report to Title IX, and you can't keep the Title IX office, you can't keep the person's information anonymous. And that's a problem, that the person is going to be contacted, especially at a time where that they're probably pretty traumatized, right? And that the what they need is not necessarily cops coming in and talking with them, but what they need is more a different type of care. Right. So it's it can be helpful, but I can see it more hurting, because as a mandated reporter, I'm listening to this person disclose to me that I have to interrupt, say, just to let you know, I'm a mandated reporter, and I have to tell somebody this. That interruption could also stop the disclosure. Does that person go to get assistance or talk with somebody else, elsewhere?
So we know that legibility by the state and its institutions is a double-edged sword, right? Yeah. And I think that's true more generally with the whole question of Gamergate, right? That when people, specifically women and women of color, are saying, hey, this is effed up and we need to do something about it, then they become the subject of derision and discipline and control, right?
And I think that that's the other thing, is like part of this for me is like increasingly thinking about this is, the alt-right is viewing a lot of and I'm totally conflating for a moment here, like men's rights activists and misogynistic trolls and people in Gamergate and white ethno-nationalists all together in this like mess for the moment. But the logic of gaming works really well, unfortunately, right, for them, because I'm thinking back to like the Occidental College event where they had the forum to report rapes online, which was then taken up by men's rights activists, flooded with false reports, thus making the forum completely unusable. Right? And so this sort of sense of like that again, that any system that's created, and I think unfortunately I'm worried, I don't want to have this pessimistic view, but I'm worried about the backlash to Me Too will happen, and that there is going to be, I don't know if it will take the exact form that Gamergate did, but I think you can already see that with the strength, the strength of men's rights folks within the tech community and within like positions of power structures can't be underestimated, and the fact that they're very adept at using technological tools to effectively silence everyone, right, which is doxing, which is, and they also control, that's the scary thing, right, that's like not saying this is a conspiracy, I don't want to get into that, but like when you have someone like Mark Zuckerberg who stood up at one point and said, people who have multiple identities are not being honest, or, that's like a vision of this notion, he was pushing for the one real name thing. This is a vision of this technology as, as visibility, right? And so that visibility comes with a whole host of risks. And that's only, so I'm worried about the gaming of all those systems, including Title IX, where you sort of like, it very easily can then turn into something that works against, as we've all talked about here, sort of like the people who are the most at risk.
Yeah, so I juxtaposing tech and prisons is so interesting here, because tech is like one of the most elite institutional sites with the most recalcitrance and the most narrow forms of identity succeeding, and with prisons we see people most dispossessed, most vulnerable to systems of power.
And they're super embedded in those, because like the whole thing about the who can talk over the, with the calls out now that, that's tech is like.
And we know that tech is very deeply invested in carceral regimes
usually,
as well.
Right?
Yeah.
I think Jenny had.
I was just going to say, I think also Title IX is I think the university, especially the public university, is in a particularly complicated position in relationship to Title IX. So some of the other stuff that was going around was this, I don't know if people read this horrifying account by this graduate student at Stanford about her basically abuser, who was her dissertation advisor. And then this idea that we are mandated reporters, that we have to do this training every year on sexual harassment, and yet we never talk about the reality of how much sexual and racialized harassment goes on this campus on a daily basis. And there's this like sense that somehow that world of sexual harassment is like out there and not here.
That's
right. And you look at like, you know, you can't, people won't even talk to, like if you're trying to do a survey of what the climate looks like, people won't even answer the surveys.
Right.
So there's really this, like, what does it mean for us as public, as agents of the state in this case, like we're public employees.
Yeah.
What does it mean for us to understand and think about and talk about sexual harassment and racialized harassment on campus?
Yeah.
And what our role is in it, and does Title IX, is Title IX even something that makes those things visible, or does it actually do more to hide it than to actually bring it out?
It goes to my last question in my talk about accounting. Yeah, and you know, like, what does it mean to be an accountant in this moment when we're having a reckoning, right? And there's all these systems and data that's coming in, that's flooding us, and that we're immersed in, but that it doesn't feel like anything is changing, or is different about this moment, although it's just another point on the line. So that wrestling with that, you know, one thing I would say is that we take away of Me Too, not the punitive dimensions of Me Too, which is to say, let's find all the Harvey Weinsteins in the world. Let's, of course, find the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, but let's, rather than seeking out monsters, right, and trying to look for the most grotesque forms of violence, actually, let's take this moment to figure out what kind of accounting we need collectively to transform the spaces that we inhabit, including UIC. Right?
Yeah, that's right. And I wanted to say those things about Title IX because I know there are a number of students in the office, in the audience, and I don't even know if you all know that, you know, that we're mandated reporters as professors, and that there is this thing called Title IX, that there is this thing called a Title IX office. Where is it?
Where are any of the offices?
Right?
QH.
On Mansfield.
Not you. I know you know. And what does that office do? Who works in that office, right? Who's supposed to be taking your a traumatic moment and taking care of that and taking care of you? You know, that's a problem. And I think about it a lot. Because of my research and because of who I'm working with, and because I think about, as a professor, as a person, I want my students to be able to come to me with questions, with concerns, so that I can help them find the resources, because I know where there are a lot of resources that they can access. And thinking about this idea of me then telling somebody else about this story, I was scrolling through the World Wide Web the other day, and I came across this just this little post on this little thing called Tumblr. Avery knows where I am. And it was a reminder that they were talking about the Holocaust, and it was a reminder that the neighbors of Jewish people also hid folks, fed folks, lied to authorities, kept their neighbors and their community safe from, or tried to do as much as possible to keep them safe in this fascism, even though it was against the law. So I think about that a lot as someone who doesn't identify as an ally in any way, but who stands in solidarity with groups and people who I don't necessarily occupy that identity, but I will stand in solidarity with those people.
Right.
Thank you all so much for this fascinating conversation. Thank you all for coming. Great.
Thank you.